Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
I'm Stephen Carroll, and this is Here's Why, where we take one news story and explain it in just a few minutes with our experts here at Bloomberg.
My proudest legacy will be that of a peacemaker and unifier. That's what I want to be, a peacemaker and a unifier.
That was Donald Trump's inauguration speech earlier this year, pledging to keep the United States out of foreign conflicts. But since then, things have changed.
A short time ago, the U.S. military carried out massive precision strikes on the three key nuclear facilities in the Iranian regime. We've recently begun using the supreme power of the United States military to destroy Venezuelan terrorists and trafficking networks led by Nicolas Maduro. We made a deal with Hamas that they're going to be very good, they're going to behave, they're going to be nice, and if they're not, we're going to go and eradicate them if we have to. We're going to do things to Nigeria that Nigeria is not going to be happy about and may very well go into that now disgraced country, guns a-blazing, to completely wipe out the Islamic terrorists who are committing these horrible, horrible atrocities.
Since returning to the White House, Trump has threatened military intervention in countries from the Middle East to Latin America. It's a marked shift in US foreign policy, which now involves a combination of military power and economic pressure. But it's also a shift in the president's own rhetoric. So here's why Trump's tone on military intervention is shifting. Our head of economics and government coverage across Europe, the Middle East, Africa and Latin America, Flavia Krause-Jackson, joins me now for more. Flavia, with your vast portfolio, you are the perfect person to talk to about this story. First of all, how big a shift in position has this been from Donald Trump?
I would suggest it isn't a big shift because I think under the augur of America First, you can just about get away with anything. As we know, Donald Trump is the proverbial weaver at large. And I think it's useful to sort of go back very much to what he is about, right? This is no longer the Republican Party of Kissinger, who passed away in 2023, the realpolitik master who really kind of coined the sort of pragmatic ambiguity. It is no longer, of course, the party of Dick Cheney, who just passed away, the neocon, who would justify military intervention under the augur of, bringing democracy. Trump is very transactional. He doesn't even pretend that he's trying to sort of get rid of bad guys or bring in the good guys. He's very much about dominating natural resources. He's all about rare earths. And I think when you're thinking specifically about Venezuela, where there really is this drum roll of like, okay, is there going to be a military intervention? And how do you square the circle between all the rhetoric of like, well, we don't meddle in other people's affairs, but here we are possibly meddling very much in what used to be known as America's backyard, which was what Latin America was known in the 80s and 70s. It's really very much about him defining his sphere of influence. So Trump is about essentially reappropriating the Western Hemisphere as he sees it. So under that banner, you can make sense of his comments about Greenland, right? Here's a massive island. It feels very much close to us. I'll take that, thank you very much. Canada as the 51st state, all very much in his sphere of influence, and Latin America, of course, as well. Venezuela is very close, and I think he's thinking, well, Venezuela is sitting on a lot of oil. I would quite like to sort of secure my own supply and be less dependent on others. And so it falls very squarely and firmly in America First. I want this, I will have it, without sort of getting too embroiled in, is Maduro a good guy or a bad guy? I think the administration would not really be pushing back about what the real reasons and what their thinking is behind this.
So is it then best understood as something that's more opportunistic than ideological, that Trump is shifting towards threats, at least, and in some cases, actual military intervention?
Yes, absolutely. I would very much see it in terms of opportunism and also keeping people on their toes, and also very much learning a little bit from what we've seen in the past year, right? I mean, if you just sort of pan out and look at some of the unprecedented events in the Middle East, we had for the very first time Israel and Iran exchange direct fire. And then we had the US under Midnight Hammer intervene directly on a strike to nuclear capabilities in Iran. The world did not end, and the battle lines were essentially redrawn. There was a new normal of what was acceptable. Now, if we're looking at some of the saber rattling on Venezuela, there hasn't been an outsized market reaction to it. Oil prices haven't particularly responded, and everyone seems to be taking it very much in their stride. If you are Chevron, for example, you're probably thinking this is great news, sort of securing oil supplies, getting American businesses going in again. So there is certainly a whole series of observers who are tracking Gerald Ford carrier sort of coming in at some speed, at some knots, and sort of taking stock of, whether something could happen by the end of the month. And it would certainly be very much in line for Trump, for example, who is not sending anyone at COP30 and has certainly made his thoughts and sentiments about the environment very clear, to do something opportunistic like that.
So how seriously then should countries like Venezuela or Nigeria be taking these threats of military intervention?
I would keep those two things very separate. I mean, I would say the fact that, Lula himself has taken time out of his schedule to engage in this debate is interesting and telling. I think just paying attention to Trump's own language that's kept all the options open. I think it's pretty clear that US officials have been briefing select members of the media, including the New York Times, about the options being open. We know that Marco Rubio, who takes a very keen interest in Latin America, certainly falls in the camp of, well, this might be quite a good idea. But I think Venezuela is a very, very different proposition to Nigeria. Venezuela falls directly in the argument I was making about the opportunism, the transactionality of Trump's foreign policy. Nigeria is quite different. It's hard to say don't take it seriously, but what I would say is what you're seeing also in the sort of redefining of the Republican Party and what MAGA is and isn't, and all the various factions, foreign policy factions. Under that umbrella, there's this sort of new Christian alt-right represented by the likes of Ted Cruz. Of course, you also have J.D. Vance, who's going to be going and representing the U.S. at the G20 in South Africa, who is a Catholic convert. And so they have been sort of driving some of this, we would call it perhaps activism of like, oh, let's look at these Christian minorities. So I would interpret Trump's comments very much as the last person who might have been in his ear. Specifically, for example, yesterday he seemed to have brought up Nigeria again. But it also, if you sort of look at the context of it, he seemed to have been talking about South America, but then kind of mixed it up with South Africa. And then it all became a big old jumble where he decided, well, I don't like South Africa at all. It shouldn't be part of the G20. And then you sort of see himself essentially trying to convince himself of what he's saying. So on Venezuela, I think there's been a very steady drumroll in that direction, whilst the comments on Nigeria seem a little bit sort of random and off the cuff.
How then should we understand the balance between the threats that Trump is making militarily and the economic pressure that he's also using to put pressure on countries that fall foul of his views?
Trump uses various instruments rather bluntly. Tariffs is one and Truth Social is another. So his two levers are economic. I don't like what you're doing and what you're saying. I will threaten you with tariffs. I don't like what you're doing or saying. I can threaten you with either cutting off military support, or I can threaten you with, potential military intervention. He won't always follow through, but I think it's very much worth bearing in mind when he does and how he does it. Again, going back to the spheres of influence, because I think that's very, very important. Let's not forget that he's also gone back and forth a fair bit on Ukraine, right? At some point, it felt like he was going in, then he was going out, then he's going back in again. And I think you can probably look at why he fundamentally hasn't done anything there to do with his rather complicated relationship with Putin, and very much how he has essentially washed his hands of Europe, sees Ukraine as Europe's problem, and sees Russia very much as an empire that's, probably more powerful than even Putin might think it is. But he sees Russia very much in empirical terms, and so has probably not very much issue with Russian expansionism in Europe, whilst he's very much about setting up his stall in the Western Hemisphere, cutting Europe off and getting ready for the war that he's engaged with in China, that is, of course, redefining its own sphere of influence.
OK, Flavia Krause-Jackson running our economics and government coverage across Europe, the Middle East, Africa and Latin America. Thank you very much. For more explanations like this from our team of 3,000 journalists and analysts around the world, go to bloomberg.com/explainers. I'm Stephen Carroll. This is Here's Why. I'll be back next week with more. Thanks for listening.